The most important thing that you need to get right when you set up your GreenStalk vertical planter is the soil. When people see how well my GreenStalks have been doing, the very first question that everyone asks me is, what kind of soil did you use? So in today's video, I'm going to spill all my secrets and I'm going to talk about exactly how I make my soil mix. And I'm also going to talk about some of the properties that I look for in the soil in order for it to perform this way. Because the GreenStalks are a little bit different than your regular containers and they need certain things to make them function at their peak. So let's dive into what those are. Now, in order to understand the type of soil that these planters need, it's also important to briefly understand how these planters work. Now, these are stacked one on top of the other, and on the topmost, there is a tray that is used to fill up water. That's how you water your planter. And there are holes in the tray. Let me show you this one, through which the water drips into the tier that it's sitting on top of. And there is a hole in the middle through which the water flows into the next level. And between each level, there's a gray saucer disc that collects the water and then drips it into the tier that it's sitting on. So it is a slow process through which water drips from the top slowly through all the way to the bottom. And there are also holes underneath each of these tiers that also drip water into the next level. So there's 2 sources of water per tier. What that means is that the soil needs to be able to absorb and hold on to water, and then the excess water drips into the next tier. So the water retentive property of the soil is super important for these planters to work well. But the soil also needs to be able to drain well, because the last thing that most plants need is roots sitting in a bunch of water all the time. So well draining as well as water retentive are key properties of the soil. And lastly, the soil needs to be super rich and super fertile. These planters rely on the soil that is in each tier, and frankly, it doesn't hold that much soil. So whatever soil is in the tier needs to be extremely nutrient rich for the plants. And in fact, I will tell you a little trick that I am using to make sure that I'm constantly fertilizing each tier. And no, it does not involve fertilizing from the top. In fact, I hardly fertilize these planters. You'll see why in just a little bit. Oh, and one last thing. The soil needs to be super light. These are vertical planters, and the soil does tend to compact over time, and using a lot of perlite is really, really important to keep the soil light. The other reason that you want the soil to be light is practical reasons. This thing gets really, really heavy. So if you want to move it around or restack it or something like that, it is much easier to do if the soil is a little bit lighter. So the 4 things you need to pay attention to for the soil is it needs to be light, well draining, moisture retentive, and very, very fertile. Okay, so here are all my, whoa, acorns. I could get killed by these things. Anyway, so here are all the ingredients. I've got them classified into the main ingredients and then what I call the additives right here. So the main ingredients, it's really simple. The ratio that I use is 1:1:1. 1 part of peat moss or Cococoir. I actually use leaf mold, but you could use any of those. Basically some inert material that holds water and is highly water retentive. Remember that property? And then I use compost, 1 part of compost. Now compost is for the fertility, obviously, and it also helps with the soil tilt. It gives it that great texture, and it really gives it that airiness that is needed for the GreenStalk. And then the 3rd part is a combination of perlite and vermiculite. Now for my regular potting mixes, I tend to go heavier on the vermiculite, again, highly water retentive, than I do with the perlite, because what perlite does is it creates a lightness in the soil. It doesn't have water retention capabilities, but it does allow for those air gaps between the soil particles. And that is probably one of the biggest differences between the GreenStalk and regular potting soil, is it needs that airiness. So I actually go heavier on the perlite when it comes to the GreenStalk soil mix. Now I will just fill this up to the brim with vermiculite, and we're going to be mixing all of these 3 together. So here we go. This is leaf mold. This over here is compost. And this is a mixture of vermiculite and perlite with a lot more perlite than vermiculite. And wear a mask when you do this. Do as I say, don't do as I do. Ooh. Now that that's settled down a little bit, let's mix this all together. Okay, so now that we've got our main soil materials all mixed in, let's talk about the additives. Now the properties that we've got in this mix are the light and airy from the perlite. We've got the vermiculite and the leaf mold or peat moss, which actually retain a lot of water. The perlite really helps with the drainage. The compost has added quite a bit of fertility, but we've got to add a few more things. So here's one of the things that I like to add is a handful of garden lime. Now, because leaf mold tends to be a little bit on the acidic side, I like to add lime to sort of counteract that a little bit. Oops, I ripped my glove. Let's just throw that away. So just a handful of lime mixed well into this should do the job. I also have some fertilizer. I like to use an organic slow release fertilizer. So mix that in as well. And then I like to add a higher nitrogen source. So you can add blood meal. I'm using alfalfa pellets, which will really add a good deal of nitrogen to the soil. And then I like to add a handful of bone meal as well. This adds the phosphorus content of the soil. Something like that. So I'm going to mix this all in. And now I'm going to tell you about my automatic fertilization process. Because believe it or not, I hardly add any external fertilizer at all to my green stalks. It's only at the time of setup that I put the secret fertilizer in. Let me show you what it is. It's worm castings. So this is my homemade worm castings. It is incredibly rich. I use all of my food scraps in it, so I know exactly what's in this thing, and it is loaded with nutrition. So that goes in there, and this also brings a lot of life into the soil. And one of the main things that is adding life is the earthworms. So these earthworms are going to continually produce fertilizer, and the way that I ensure that they are fed is I just break off leaves from my green stalk, or I might eat a strawberry and I just shove it into the tier. So they're constantly being fed and they're constantly generating fertilizer for me. So I'd say my entire season I've probably fertilized maybe twice with liquid fertilizer. That's it. So I'm going to mix this all together. What I showed you today makes enough soil to fill up almost 2 of the original tiers of the green stalk. So I hope you found this useful, folks, and do leave some comments below if you've got any ideas on how to make even better soil. This is just my recipe. It's worked out really well for me, and I'm sure that others have great tips that they can share as well. So do leave some comments below and share this with those who are in the process of getting their first green stalk set up. This is something that is a lot of expense for a new green stalk owner, and if you can make your own, why not? It's actually not that hard. Until next time, live green and love your greens.